Tonight, let's visit Spain's greatest dreamer together. A man who looked at windmills and saw giants, who refused to accept the world as it was. If you drift away while listening, that's perfectly fine. The story continues whether you're awake or dreaming, just like Don Quixote's own adventures did. This is a story about imagination so powerful it reshapes reality itself. About a man whose dreams became more real than the waking world around him. In a village of La Mancha, whose name the author chose to forget, there lived a gentleman of about 50 years. His name was Alonso Quixote. He spent his days and nights reading books of chivalry, until the line between stories and reality dissolved like morning mist over the plains. Picture Spain in the late 1500s. The golden age was fading, empires crumbling, and in dusty villages, old men still dreamed of glory. His study was a small room overflowing with books stacked floor to ceiling. Candles burned low as he read through night after night, forgetting to eat. One morning he decided the world needed him. Not as Alonso Quixote the country gentleman, but as a knight-errant who would right every wrong. He found his great-grandfather's armor in a dusty corner of the house. It was rusted, pieces missing, held together with leather straps and hope. He spent a week patching the armor with cardboard and wire, polishing what could be polished, and fashioning a visor from stiff paper and paste. He tested the helmet with his sword. One swing and it shattered into pieces. So he made another, and wisely chose never to test it again. Every knight needs a noble steed. He looked at his old horse, all bones and sway-backed wariness, and named him Rocinante, finest horse in Spain. And for himself, he chose a name that would ring through the ages. Alonso Quixote became Don Quixote de la Mancha, Knight of the Sorrowful Countenance. But something was still missing. Every true knight must have a lady to whom he dedicates all his deeds, all his suffering, all his glory. He remembered a peasant girl he'd glimpsed once in the village of El Toboso. In his mind, she became Dulcinea, princess of his heart forever. Before dawn on a July morning, Don Quixote slipped out of his village alone. The road stretched before him, trembling with possibility and danger. As he rode, the ordinary countryside transformed before his eyes. Every shadow became a potential enemy, every distant sound a cry for rescue. By evening he reached a humble inn on the roadside. But Don Quixote saw something else entirely. A magnificent castle with towers reaching toward heaven. The innkeeper watched this strange thin man in rusted armor approach, and decided to play along. There was no harm in humoring a harmless madman. Don Quixote knelt before the innkeeper and begged to be dubbed a proper knight. Without the ceremony, his adventures could never truly begin. So at midnight by the horse trough, with 2 giggling women as witnesses, the innkeeper tapped Don Quixote's shoulder with a sword and declared him a knight. The next morning he met merchants on the road and demanded they acknowledge Dulcinea as the most beautiful woman in the world, sight unseen. When they laughed at him, he charged, but Rocinante stumbled, and the merchant's servants beat the fallen knight with his own broken lance, until he couldn't rise. A neighbor found him lying in the road, barely conscious, muttering about enchantments and enemies. He was dragged home on a donkey like a sack of grain. His friends burned his books that night, hoping to destroy the madness at its source. But the fire only freed the stories to live inside him forever. Don Quixote lay in his bed for days, bruised and broken, but his mind was already galloping toward the next adventure. Rest could not contain him. The housekeeper wrung her hands and wailed to anyone who would listen. Those cursed books had stolen her master's wits, and now nearly his life. Young Antonia knelt beside her uncle's bed, holding his thin hand, begging him through tears to abandon this madness before it killed him completely. But Don Quixote only smiled and explained that enchanters had hidden his precious books, not destroyed them. The magic could never truly be burned away. In a cottage nearby lived Sancho Panza, a farmer with a round belly, a good heart, and a head full of proverbs. He had a wife, children, and a donkey. Don Quixote visited Sancho with a remarkable proposition. "Become my squire," he said, "and I will make you governor of an island when our adventures succeed." Teresa, Sancho's wife, planted herself in the doorway with arms crossed. She knew this scheme would bring nothing but trouble and empty promises of grandeur. Yet the dream of nobility proved stronger than Teresa's warnings. Sancho imagined himself in velvet robes, servants bowing, and his children calling him Lord Governor. They gathered supplies in secret: blankets, cheese, wine, and dried meat. Sancho brought his beloved donkey Dapple, steady and patient as the earth itself. Under a blanket of stars they slipped away from the sleeping village, two silhouettes heading toward a horizon that promised everything and guaranteed nothing at all. Dawn painted La Mancha in shades of gold and amber. The vast plain stretched before them, empty and endless, waiting to be filled with meaning. Then Don Quixote stopped Rocinante and pointed toward the horizon. There, rising from a low hill, stood shapes that made his heart race with purpose. Giants, he declared, his voice trembling with righteous fury. 30 monstrous giants with arms spinning, threatening all good people of this land. We must destroy them. Sancho shaded his eyes and looked again. "Master," he said carefully, "those are windmills. Just windmills. Their sails turn because that is what windmills do." But Don Quixote was already spurring Rocinante forward, lowering his lance, crying out to Dulcinea to witness his courage against these terrible foes of mankind. His lance caught in a turning sail. The wind shifted, the great arm swung, and horse and rider were lifted and flung tumbling across the rocky ground. When Sancho reached him, Don Quixote lay crumpled in the grass, lance shattered, helmet dented, one arm twisted at an angle that made the squire wince. "The wizard Freston did this," Don Quixote gasped. "He transformed the giants into windmills the instant before I struck, to rob me of glorious victory." Sancho said nothing. He simply helped his master onto Rocinante's back, steadying the thin body with his strong peasant arms. They would continue regardless of truth. Onward they rode, the knight bent with pain but refusing to turn back. Adventure waited around every corner, and injuries were merely proof of noble effort. That night they made camp beneath a great cork oak, sharing bread and hard cheese, while stars wheeled slowly overhead like the sails of celestial windmills. Don Quixote spoke of the Golden Age, when knights protected the innocent and honor meant more than gold. His voice carried the weight of genuine longing. Sancho scratched his belly and admitted he would rather have actual gold than a golden age. But he listened respectfully, because he loved his strange master. The next day brought figures on the road. 2 Benedictine friars in black robes riding mules, escorting a lady's carriage to some distant destination. Don Quixote's eyes widened. "Enchanters," he shouted, drawing his sword. "Evil magicians who have kidnapped a princess! We must free her at once! Noble Sancho!" He charged before Sancho could speak. The terrified friars tumbled from their mules into the roadside ditches, robes tangling, beads scattering across the dusty ground. A Biscayan servant defending the carriage drew his sword in fury. Real steel met real steel, and suddenly the game became genuinely dangerous for everyone. Both men bled before the lady in the carriage screamed for them to stop. Don Quixote had lost part of his ear, but counted himself victorious regardless. He demanded that the defeated servant travel to Toboso and kneel before Dulcinea, acknowledging her supreme beauty. The bewildered man agreed to anything for escape. Meanwhile, back in the village, the priest and barber made plans. Their friend had to be brought home before he got himself killed chasing fantasies. They would need a disguise, something to appeal to Don Quixote's chivalric delusions. The barber suggested dressing as a damsel in distress who needed rescuing. Far from such plots, Don Quixote and Sancho encountered shepherds tending their flocks. The simple men shared food and fire and stories of lost love. One shepherd told of Marcella, a beautiful woman who refused all suitors and lived alone in the mountains. Men said she was cruel, but was she? Don Quixote declared that Marcella had every right to refuse love. A woman owes no man her heart simply because he desires it. The shepherds fell silent, surprised. They attended a funeral the next day. A lovesick shepherd who died of heartbreak. The mourners argued about blame while Don Quixote defended the absent Marcella. Rocinante wandered into a group of Yangasan mares one afternoon, seeking companionship. The drovers watching the mares took violent exception to his advances with their sticks. Don Quixote rushed to defend his horse and was beaten senseless. Sancho tried to help and suffered the same fate. They lay groaning together in the grass. Somehow they crawled to another inn by nightfall, bodies screaming with every movement. The innkeeper gave them a room and tried not to laugh at their condition. Don Quixote remembered a magic healing potion from his books. He mixed olive oil, wine, rosemary, and salt, convinced it would restore them both to strength. The balsam made them violently sick. Don Quixote vomited and felt better, but poor Sancho purged from both ends until he thought he might actually die. That night, a servant girl named Maritornes crept through the darkness seeking another guest. She stumbled into Don Quixote's bed by mistake. Chaos instantly erupted. Bodies collided in the blackness, fists flew at shadows, furniture crashed. By the time someone lit a candle, everyone was bruised and no one could explain why. The next morning, muleteers in the courtyard decided Sancho needed additional punishment. They threw him on a blanket and tossed him high into the air. Laughing, Don Quixote watched from an upper window, too weak to help. He shouted curses and threats at the laughing muleteers, but they only tossed Sancho higher. They fled the inn without paying, Sancho still groaning from his aerial adventure. The innkeeper's curses followed them down the dusty road toward new disasters. Two great dust clouds appeared on the plain, approaching from opposite directions. Don Quixote reined Rocinante to a halt, eyes shining with sudden terrible excitement. Armies, he breathed, then began describing in elaborate detail the knights, kings, and kingdoms about to clash in glorious battle. He named each imaginary banner and lord. Sancho squinted at the approaching clouds and saw only sheep. Two enormous flocks of sheep being driven to market, bleeding and dusty. Nothing more at all. Don Quixote charged into the flock, lance swinging, killing 7 sheep, before the furious shepherds could bring him down with stones from their slings, impact after impact. The stones knocked out teeth and cracked ribs. Don Quixote fell from Rocinante into the trampling hooves of terrified sheep, tasting blood and wool and bitter defeat. Sancho knelt beside his master and counted the missing teeth. 4, maybe 5. He applied the terrible balsam again, and they both suffered for his kindness. That night they encountered torches in the darkness, a funeral procession carrying a corpse to its final rest. The flames bobbed like spirits through the black countryside. Sancho looked at his master's gap-toothed, battered face and gave him a name that would echo through literature. "The Knight of the Sorrowful Countenance," he said. Don Quixote attacked the mourners, convinced they were evil things carrying an innocent victim. The priests scattered, dropping their burden, torches rolling across the ground. One fallen priest broke his leg in the commotion. His screams of pain and curses at the madmen who attacked honest mourners echoed across the empty plains. For a moment Don Quixote felt genuine remorse. But he quickly explained that knights must act on appearances, and evil often disguises itself as innocent funeral processions. Deep in the night, terrible sounds reached them, rhythmic pounding and rushing water that seemed to shake the very earth. Both man and squire froze in their saddles. Sancho, terrified his master would charge into the unknown darkness, quietly tied Rocinante's legs together. The horse couldn't move no matter how Don Quixote spurred him. Dawn revealed the source of the terrifying sound. Water-powered hammers beating cloth at a fulling mill. Don Quixote stared. Sancho began to laugh and couldn't stop. Don Quixote beat Sancho with his lance for laughing, then immediately apologized. The shame of being afraid of a cloth mill burned worse than any enemy's sword. On the road they saw a man riding with something golden glinting on his head. Don Quixote recognized it instantly as the legendary helmet of Mambrino, worth a kingdom. The terrified barber fled from the charging knight, leaving his mule and basin behind. Don Quixote placed the basin on his head, pronouncing it the perfect magical helm. Sancho claimed the barber's abandoned donkey saddle as his prize. A proper squire deserved proper equipment, and this saddle was finer than anything he'd ever owned. The next day brought a more troubling sight, a chain gang of prisoners being marched to the coast. 12 men bound together, guards walking alongside with weapons ready. Don Quixote rode forward and demanded to know why these men were enslaved. No person should be forced against their will, he declared. Freedom was a sacred right. Each prisoner told his crime when asked. One stole, one loved too freely, one was a pimp, one wrote satirical poems. All claimed injustice, some more convincingly than others. Don Quixote attacked the guards before Sancho could protest. Surprised and outnumbered by knight, squire, and suddenly freed prisoners, the guards fled for their lives into the brush. But gratitude was not in the criminal's nature. When Don Quixote asked them to visit Dulcinea, they pelted him with stones and stole what they could carry. Bruised and robbed by those he freed, Don Quixote decided they needed to hide. Into the wild mountains of Sierra Morena they rode, seeking safety from the law. In those mountains they found a madman living wild among the rocks, naked, bearded, leaping from boulder to boulder like a goat. His name was Cardenio, once a gentleman. Between fits of madness, Cardenio told his story. He had loved a woman named Lucinda, but his friend Fernando stole her away through trickery and betrayal. When Don Quixote mentioned a book of chivalry, something snapped in Cardenio's mind. His eyes went wild and he attacked without warning, fists flying at shadows and friends alike. When the madness passed, everyone had scattered among the boulders. 2 madmen and 1 bewildered peasant, lost separately in the same lonely mountains, nursing new bruises. Don Quixote declared he would do penance in these mountains for Dulcinea, just as Amadis had done for his lady. He would go mad with love, deliberately. He composed a letter to Dulcinea, full of flowery language and impossible devotion. Sancho was to deliver it to Toboso and return with her blessing and perhaps a token. Sancho rode away with the precious letter, leaving his master to tumble on rocks and cry to the sky. The squire worried, but could not refuse the command. Alone among the crags, Don Quixote stripped to his shirt and began his penance. He tumbled, he prayed, he carved Dulcinea's name into trees, he wept at the stars. Sancho met the priest and barber on the road. They had come searching for their friend. The squire told them everything, amazed that people wanted to hear his rambling tale. Then Sancho realized the letter was still in his saddlebag, which was back in the mountains with Don Quixote. He tried to recite it from memory, mangling every beautiful phrase. Together they hatched a plan. They would find a woman to pretend she was a princess who needed Don Quixote's help and lead him out of the mountains that way. Fortune provided what they needed. A young woman dressed as a boy appeared in the mountains, fleeing some trouble of her own. Her name was Dorothea. Dorothea told her own tale of woe, seduced and abandoned by the same Don Fernando who betrayed Cardenio. The mountains were full of broken hearts that summer. They convinced Dorothea to play a role. Princess Micomicona, a royal lady whose kingdom had been stolen by a giant. Only Don Quixote could save her imaginary throne. The ruse worked perfectly. Don Quixote agreed immediately to help the beautiful princess defeat her giant. His penance was complete. Duty called him back to the world. The whole group traveled together toward an inn, the very same inn where Sancho had been tossed in a blanket. Don Quixote did not remember the place well, and there, impossibly, Cardenio and Fernando collided. The betrayer and betrayed, the stolen bride Lucinda, all gathered in one crowded room. Words flew like swords. Fernando repented. Perhaps it was the crowded witnesses, perhaps genuine shame. He returned to Dorothea, and Cardenio embraced his Lucinda at last, Love stories ended happily for once. That night Don Quixote dreamed of giants. Sleepwalking to the wine storage, he attacked the leather wine skins with his sword, slashing them until red wine flooded the room. A captive soldier at the inn shared his own tale. Years as a slave in Algiers, escape with a Moorish woman who converted for love. Stories nested inside stories. Romances resolved all around the inn. Couples reunited, families recognized each other. Everyone seemed to find their pair like figures in a dance. Don Quixote watched content. Master Pedro arrived with his puppet show. Wooden figures acting out romances of Moors and Christians. Don Quixote watched the tiny dramas unfold with growing emotional investment. When wooden Moors chased a wooden maiden, Don Quixote could bear it no longer. He drew his sword and hacked the puppets to splinters, saving no one real from nothing. He paid for the destroyed puppets, coin by coin, grumbling that enchanters had made the Moors appear wooden to trick him. Master Pedro counted his money and vanished. The priest and barber finally enacted their plan. They built a wooden cage on an ox cart, convinced Don Quixote that enchantment had befallen him, and locked him inside. Homeward bound in his cage, Don Quixote accepted his fate with strange dignity. Enchanters could imprison his body, he declared, but never his knightly spirit. The adventure would continue. The ox cart rolled into the village as neighbors gathered to stare. Their local madman returned in a cage like a captured beast, thin and dignified and utterly unbroken. Teresa Panza pushed through the crowd and grabbed her husband's arm. "Where is my island?" she demanded. "Where is the gold you promised our children would inherit?" Sancho defended their adventures with surprising passion. They had come close to greatness, he insisted. The island was still waiting, just temporarily enchanted beyond their reach. They carried Don Quixote to his bed, unlocking the cage gently. The housekeeper and niece fussed over him with tears and broth and prayers. He would finally rest. A learned canon visited to debate with the famous madmen. They argued for hours about fiction and truth, about whether imagination could create its own reality worth living. Don Quixote argued that stories could be more true than facts, that believing in nobility and honor made the world better, even if the believer looked foolish doing so. Weeks passed in quiet recovery. Don Quixote read no books, took his meals, spoke reasonably with visitors. But his eyes kept drifting toward the window and the open road beyond. Then young Sanson Carrasco arrived from the university at Salamanca, bringing news that changed everything. He was clever, athletic, and carried a book under his arm with a familiar title. The Adventures of Don Quixote had been published as a book. All of Spain was reading about the Knight of the Sorrowful Countenance. He was famous beyond his wildest imaginings. Don Quixote examined his own story with a critical eye. Some details were wrong, he complained. The historian had made errors about Dulcinea's beauty and several battle outcomes. Sanson had a secret plan. He would challenge Don Quixote to combat, defeat him, and demand he return home for a year. A cure through the language of madness itself. But first Don Quixote announced his intention to ride again. He would compete in the justing tournaments at Saragossa, proving his worth against Spain's greatest knights in formal combat. Sancho needed little convincing. The promise of the island still glowed in his imagination like a torch. Teresa's objections faded against dreams of nobility for their children. Under cover of darkness they departed once more. Two old men chasing young dreams across the same starlit plains. Hoofbeats soft on the dusty road toward uncertain glory. First, Don Quixote insisted they must visit Toboso and receive Dulcinea's blessing. A knight could not begin a quest without his lady's favor, and perhaps a token to wear. They wandered through Toboso's dark streets seeking a palace that existed only in Don Quixote's mind. Every humble cottage looked wrong. Every door belonged to common peasants. Sancho's terror grew with every moment. He had never actually seen Dulcinea. He had invented her whereabouts, her responses, everything he'd reported. Now truth demanded payment. At dawn Sancho made a desperate gamble. He pointed at 3 peasant women riding donkeys toward market, and declared that enchanters had transformed Dulcinea into this coarse form. Don Quixote saw only what was there, a country girl smelling of garlic. Confused by the strange thin man kneeling before her donkey and calling her princess of his heart broke visibly. The most beautiful lady in the world reduced to this by evil magic. He wept in the road while the confused women rode past, hurrying to market. He swore a sacred vow to break the enchantment, to restore Dulcinea to her true beauty, no matter what trials he must endure. Purpose returned with the force of obsession. On the road they encountered a cart of traveling players dressed in fantastic costumes. Devils, angels, emperors, Death himself with his scythe, a mobile theater of the absurd. Don Quixote spoke gravely with the actor playing Death. They discussed mortality and meaning, while Sancho nervously eyed the fake demons lounging in the cart eating bread and cheese. A costume jester rang his bells at Rocinante, and the old horse bolted in terror. Don Quixote tumbled off among the props and costumes, dignity scattered like his armor. Humiliated but unhurt, Don Quixote refused to fight mere players. Real knights did not cross swords with pretenders, no matter how realistic their costumes of death and devil. In a forest clearing at twilight, another knight appeared in glittering armor covered with small mirrors. He challenged Don Quixote, claiming his own lady was more beautiful than Dulcinea. Both knights prepared through the night for dawn combat. Don Quixote prayed and polished his battered armor. The mirror knight waited in the shadows, confident in his secret plan. Dawn broke golden over the field of combat. 2 horses charged across the dewy grass, lances lowered, morning light flashing from mirror armor like 100 small suns. Don Quixote's lance struck true. The mirror knight tumbled from his horse, crashed to earth, and lay still. Against all odds and expectations, the old madman had won genuinely. Don Quixote dismounted and lifted the fallen knight's visor. Beneath he saw the face of young Sanson Carrasco from his own village. The plan to cure him had failed completely. Magnanimous in victory, Don Quixote demanded only that Sanson acknowledge Dulcinea's supreme beauty and present himself to her in Toboso. He let the defeated scholar rise unharmed. Sanson limped away in shame, but already planning his revenge. He would return in different armor, fight again. And this time nothing would be left to chance or fortune. Don Quixote rode onward with renewed faith. This victory proved his calling was real. The world did need knights errant, and he had been chosen to answer that need. They met Don Diego de Miranda, a wealthy landowner dressed in green, riding peacefully through the countryside. He invited them to rest at his comfortable estate nearby. Don Diego's house was everything Don Quixote's was not: orderly, prosperous, peaceful. The walls held no chivalric romances, only practical ledgers and accounts of a well-managed life. Don Diego's son Lorenzo was a young poet who debated literature passionately with Don Quixote late into the evening. 2 very different minds found unexpected common ground in words. Though they knew he was mad, the household came to respect Don Quixote. His courtesy never faltered, his kindness seemed genuine, and his ideals touched something true even in delusion. On the road again they encountered an extraordinary sight: a cart carrying 2 great cages with African lions inside, being transported to the king as gifts from the governor of Oran. Don Quixote demanded the cage be opened. He would fight the lions to prove his courage once and for all. Neither the carter's pleas nor Sancho's terror could dissuade him. The cage door opened. The lion stretched, yawned enormously, looked at the thin old man waving a sword at him, turned around, and lay back down showing only his hindquarters. Don Quixote declared total victory. He had faced the lion and the beast had refused to fight. From this day forward, he would be known as the Knight of the Lions. News reached them of a grand wedding. Rich Camacho was marrying beautiful Quiteria, though everyone knew she truly loved the poor shepherd Basilio, who had no money to offer. They found Basilio lurking at the wedding's edge, gaunt with heartbreak, watching the woman he loved prepare to marry another man. Don Quixote recognized a fellow sufferer of love's cruelty. At the ceremony's climax, Basilio burst forward and appeared to stab himself through the heart. Dying, he begged one last wish, to be married to Quiteria before death took him. The priest performed a hasty marriage over the dying man. The moment vows were exchanged, Basilio leaped up perfectly healthy. The sword had been a trick, the blood a bladder of pig's blood. Don Quixote stepped between Camacho's angry friends and the newlyweds, declaring that love's triumph must be respected. True feeling had defeated mere wealth, as it should always be. Near Montesinos's cave, famous from ancient legends, Don Quixote grew intensely curious. He declared he would be lowered into the depths to discover what enchantments waited in the darkness below. They lowered him on ropes into the blackness, his voice growing fainter until silence swallowed everything. Sancho waited above, counting the rope lengths, fear growing with every passing minute. An hour later they hauled him up, and Don Quixote emerged claiming he had slept 3 days below. He had seen wonders, enchanted knights, crystal palaces, the sleeping heroes of Spanish legend. He described meeting Montesinos himself, the ancient guardian of sleeping knights, who awaited Spain's hour of greatest need. Crystal walls reflected eternal torchlight on armor that never rusted. But strangest of all, even in his vision, Dulcinea appeared as an enchanted peasant girl. She approached him to borrow money, wanting to pawn her petticoat for 6 reals. Sancho said nothing, but privately wondered if his master had dreamed the entire thing, or worse, invented it consciously. The cave had no crystal palaces that any rope could reach. Neither could prove what happened in that darkness. Perhaps there were truths that only madness could perceive, visions that existed between waking and sleep, where stories lived and breathed. At a roadside inn they met Master Pedro with his fortune, telling monkey and puppet theater. The monkey seemed to know secrets. It identified Don Quixote before anyone spoke his name. The monkey revealed that Master Pedro was actually Ginés de Pasamonte, the cleverest of the galley slaves Don Quixote had freed. Fortune had twisted their paths together again. The puppet show began, a tale of rescued maidens and pursuing Moors. Don Quixote watched the tiny wooden figures with dangerous intensity, his hand moving unconsciously toward his sword hilt. He could bear it no longer. Drawing his sword, Don Quixote attacked the puppet stage, hacking the Moorish puppets to splinters to save a maiden who was only painted wood and cloth. They found an abandoned boat on the riverbank, and Don Quixote declared it was placed there by destiny to carry them to a princess in need. They climbed aboard despite Sancho's protests. The current carried them directly into a water mill. The boat splintered against the great turning wheels, and both men tumbled into the churning water, flailing for their lives. Flowered, dusted millers pulled them from the river, cursing them for damaging the wheel mechanism. Don Quixote paid for repairs, blaming invisible enchanters for ruining what should have been a glorious voyage. Word of the famous knight reached a duke and duchess who had read his published adventures. They invited him to their palace, secretly planning elaborate entertainment at his expense. The palace received them with mock ceremony fit for royalty. Servants bowed, musicians played, and the duke and duchess watched from their thrones, barely concealing their amusement at the shabby knight. Sancho's earthy wisdom and endless proverbs amused the nobility despite themselves. They had expected buffoonery, but found genuine wit buried in his peasant speech and practical observations. They staged an elaborate prophecy. A figure dressed as Merlin appeared in smoke and thunder, announcing that Dulcinea could only be disenchanted through Sancho's suffering, specifically 3,300 lashes. Sancho refused absolutely. No lady's beauty was worth flaying the skin from his own back. Let Dulcinea remain a peasant forever. He needed his hide more than she needed her face. Don Quixote begged, wept, offered to do the whipping himself if only it could transfer to Sancho's account. But the prophecy was specific. Only the squire's suffering would break the spell. Money finally persuaded where love could not. Don Quixote offered to pay for each lash, and Sancho calculated what 3,300 payments might mean for his family. Sancho agreed, but on his own schedule, in his own time, and at his own pace. He would whip himself when he felt like it, and not one moment before or after. The Duke presented a wooden horse named Clavillano for their next adventure. It would fly through the air, they claimed, carrying knight and squire to rescue a distant princess. Blindfolded and believing, master and squire mounted the wooden horse. Servants blew bellows to simulate wind while they sat stationary, convinced they flew among the stars toward adventure. Fireworks hidden in the horse exploded, sending both men tumbling to the ground. They awoke convinced they had traveled thousands of leagues and returned victorious from impossible distances. Sancho told wonderful lies about what he'd seen. The earth like a mustard seed below, playing with goats among the constellations. Don Quixote listened with suspicious fascination. Don Quixote proposed a bargain. He would believe Sancho's stars if Sancho would believe his cave of Montesinos. Two impossible truths could support each other against a doubting world. The Duke made Sancho governor of a town called Barataria as a jest. But Sancho accepted the position with unexpected seriousness, ready to prove a peasant could rule wisely. Master and squire parted for the first time since their adventures began. Don Quixote embraced Sancho and gave him advice. Be just, be merciful, and remember where you came from. Governor Sancho arrived at Barataria to discover a town full of people playing along with the joke. But their problems were real enough, and they watched to see what he would do. They presented him with impossible cases to judge. A man who gave money to cross a bridge, but lied about his purpose, creating a logical paradox about truth and penalty. But Sancho's common sense cut through clever traps. He judged with peasant wisdom that scholars couldn't match, finding fair solutions where logic offered only contradictions. Then came the staged attack, bells ringing, people screaming invasion. Servants strapped Sancho between two heavy shields and told him to lead the defense. He couldn't move or see or breathe. When they finally freed him, Sancho announced his abdication. He kissed his donkey and declared that governing was no life for him. He needed his freedom and his friend more than any title. He found Don Quixote on the road from the palace, and they embraced like brothers separated by war. Both had suffered separately, but suffering shared was easier to bear. Back at the Duke's palace, the cruel entertainments continued. They dressed servants as demons to torment Don Quixote at night, testing how far his delusions would stretch. Through every humiliation, Don Quixote maintained his dignity. He treated servants like nobles and insults like compliments, transforming their mockery into opportunities for graciousness they couldn't corrupt. A maid named Altisidora pretended to die of unrequited love for Don Quixote. Lying on a bier surrounded by candles, while the court watched to see if he would break faith with Dulcinea. He felt compassion but not temptation. His heart belonged to Dulcinea alone, enchanted or not. The maid's fake death could not shake a love built on imagination's purest foundation. Finally released from the palace's cruel hospitality, master and squire rode toward Barcelona and the sea. Don Quixote had never seen the ocean, and it called to something in his wandering soul. Barcelona appeared on the horizon, towers, harbors, ships with sails like wings. The Mediterranean sparkled beyond, endless water meeting endless sky in a line Don Quixote had only read about. He rode Rocinante into the surf and let the waves lap at the old horse's hooves. Salt wind filled his lungs. The world was larger than even his imagination had suggested. In the city they visited a printing shop where, impossibly, Don Quixote saw his own book being printed. Pages of his adventures hung drying on lines like laundry made of words. He read passages about himself and felt the strange vertigo of becoming a character in someone else's story. Which was more real, the knight who lived or the words that described him? On the beach at dawn, another knight appeared, armor of silver, white plume waving, announcing himself as the Knight of the White Moon. Sanson had returned for revenge. The terms were absolute. The loser must return home and abandon knight-errantry for 1 full year. Don Quixote accepted without hesitation. A true knight could not refuse honorable challenge. Citizens of Barcelona gathered on the shore to watch. Word had spread of the strange knight, who tilted at windmills, and they wanted to see his final battle against this silver challenger. The horses charged across the sand. But Rocinante stumbled on the uncertain footing, his old legs betraying him at the crucial moment, and Don Quixote never reached his opponent with lance. He crashed to the sand and lay still. The Knight of the White Moon placed his lance point at Don Quixote's throat and demanded surrender, demanded he deny Dulcinea's beauty. "Kill me," Don Quixote whispered through the sand in his mouth. "I will die before I deny the beauty of Dulcinea del Toboso. Take my life, but not my faith." The White Moon withdrew his lance. He required only the year's retirement, not denial of love. Don Quixote could keep his faith in Dulcinea if he would simply go home. As the victor removed his helmet, Don Quixote recognized Sanson again. The young scholar from his village had finally achieved his cure, but his face showed no triumph, only sadness. Something broke in Don Quixote that all the beatings and humiliations had failed to break. This was not defeat by enchanters, but by the ordinary world, by a young man he had known. The journey home began. Master and squire rode in silence for long stretches, the knight no longer pointing out giants in windmills or armies and flocks of sheep. Don Quixote proposed a new dream. They could become shepherds instead. They could tend flocks and write poetry and sing songs about love, a gentler madness for their old age. Sancho agreed instantly. If his master wanted to be a shepherd, then Sancho would be a shepherd too. Anything to keep them together, anything to keep some dream alive. They chose shepherd names for themselves, Quixotes and Pancino, or perhaps something more classical. The details didn't matter as long as the dream remained possible. But fate had one more humiliation. A great herd of pigs thundered down the road and trampled both knight and squire, leaving them bruised and mud-covered in the ditch. Even nature mocked them. They picked themselves up and continued without complaint. Home was close now. The familiar skyline of their village appeared against the evening sky like a promise of rest finally kept. The windmills stood unchanged on their hill, sails turning in the evening breeze. Don Quixote looked at them and saw, perhaps for the first time, only windmills. The giants had finally died. A boy's voice carried across the fields. He was saying to another child about a cricket cage he'd lost. "You'll never see her again." Don Quixote shuddered at the omen. The village welcomed them with worried faces. The housekeeper, the niece, Teresa Panza, all rushing out with tears and questions. Don Quixote dismounted slowly, like a very old man coming home from war. They put him to bed and called the doctor, but Don Quixote was already falling into a deep fever. His body finally surrendered to a lifetime of beatings, falls, and broken dreams. For many days he slept a sleep like death, speaking to no one, eating nothing. His family watched and waited and prayed, wondering if the knight would ever wake again, and if so, as whom. Now let's step back from the story and meet the man who created it. Miguel de Cervantes was born in 1547 in Alcalá de Henares, a university town near Madrid. His father was a barber surgeon, a traveling doctor who set bones and drew blood. The family moved constantly, chasing patients and fleeing debts through Spain's dusty towns and villages. Young Miguel learned to read wherever books could be found. His education came in fragments. A monastery school here, a grammar lesson there, imagination filling every gap that poverty left. His first published work appeared when he was 21. A poem mourning the death of Queen Isabella. It earned him nothing but the taste of seeing his words in print. Poetry paid nothing, so Cervantes sought honor and income as a soldier. He joined the Spanish infantry and sailed toward the greatest naval battle of his century against the Ottoman Empire. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was Europe's answer to Ottoman expansion. 300 ships met in the Gulf of Patras, and the sea turned red with blood of Christians and Muslims alike. Cervantes was sick with fever below decks when the fighting began. He demanded to be brought up to fight, saying he would rather die in battle than hide sick in bed. 3 gunshot wounds, 2 in the chest, 1 in the left hand that would never work properly again. He called his maimed hand his glory for the rest of his life. Returning to Spain years later as a decorated veteran, his ship was captured by Barbary pirates. Cervantes and his brother were taken to Algiers and sold as slaves in the marketplace. 5 years he spent in Algiers, attempting escape 4 times. Each failure brought punishment, but Cervantes took all blame to protect those who helped him, earning his captors grudging respect. His family sold everything they owned to raise the ransom. In 1580, at 33 years old, Cervantes finally returned to Spain, older, poorer, damaged in body but with stories burning inside him. He married a woman named Catalina, 18 years younger than himself. The marriage brought neither happiness nor children, only a strained silence that lasted until his death, both living separate lives. He tried to make his fortune as a playwright, but this was the age of Lope de Vega, Spain's theatrical genius. Cervantes' plays couldn't compete, and the theaters turned him away, desperate for income. He took a job as a tax collector for the government, traveling through Andalusia requisitioning grain and oil for the Spanish Armada preparing to invade England. The Armada sailed and sank in 1588, defeated by English ships and storms. All that requisitioned grain fed no conquering army, only fish at the bottom of the English Channel. A banker holding government funds failed, and Cervantes went to prison though he had stolen nothing. He sat in a Seville jail cell while bureaucrats sorted out the mess slowly, indifferently. Legend says Don Quixote was born in that prison cell. Whether true or not, Cervantes certainly had time to think, to remember, to imagine a different kind of hero for a disappointed age. The Spain of Cervantes' lifetime was an empire in slow collapse. They had conquered half the world, but couldn't feed their own people. Glory and poverty walked hand in hand. Silver flooded in from American mines, but instead of creating wealth, it destroyed the economy through inflation. A loaf of bread cost 10 times what it had cost a generation earlier. Spain was obsessed with pure blood and titles. If your ancestors had been Muslims or Jews, you could not hold office. Innovation suffocated under rules about who your grandparents were. Meanwhile, the people escaped into fantasy. Chivalric romances sold enormously. Stories of perfect knights, evil wizards, and damsels in distress. Everyone read them, even those who mocked them reading. Amadis de Gaula was the most famous. A perfect knight who never lost, whose love was pure, whose adventures solved every problem through courage and magic. Cervantes knew these books by heart. He loved them, and he hated them. They were beautiful lies that made people forget real problems. His Don Quixote would be a man who believed these lies completely, and suffered for believing. The first part of Don Quixote appeared in 1605 when Cervantes was 57 years old. After decades of failure, he finally held a book that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. The book sold immediately and kept selling. Within months, pirated editions appeared across Spain and spread to Portugal, Italy, France. Don Quixote became the first international bestseller of the modern age. But Cervantes saw little of the money. Publishers owned the rights and paid him a flat fee. He watched others grow rich from his creation, while he remained as poor as ever. Then in 1614, something outrageous happened. A writer using the name Avellaneda published a fake sequel to Don Quixote, a cruel parody that missed everything Cervantes had meant. Cervantes' revenge was brilliant. He rushed to complete his own part 2, and in it, his characters encounter and mock the fake book, calling its author a fraud within the story itself. Even better, he killed Don Quixote at the end. No one could write another false sequel about a dead character. The knight's death was both artistic choice and legal strategy against thieves. Part 2 appeared in 1615, a year before Cervantes died. Many consider it even greater than Part 1, deeper, sadder, more aware of the tragedy hiding inside the comedy all along. Cervantes' body was failing. Dropsy swelled his limbs, made breathing difficult. In April 1616, he knew death was coming and wrote one final dedication to his patron with characteristic humor. He died on April 22 in 1615, though legend claims April 23, the same traditional date as Shakespeare's death. Two giants of literature, departing the world within days of each other. They buried him in a convent in Madrid, but the grave was unmarked. For 4 centuries, no one knew exactly where Cervantes' bones lay. His creation was immortal, his body was lost. In 2015, archaeologists finally found what they believed to be his remains in that same convent. Bones of a man with old injuries to the left hand and chest. The soldier-writer came home at last. But what makes Don Quixote the first modern novel? Before Cervantes, fiction was either romance or satire. He invented something new, a story that was both funny and tragic at once. His characters have psychology. They change over time, they surprise us, they contain contradictions that feel real. Sancho begins as simple and ends as wise. Don Quixote's madness hides genuine nobility. He invented metafiction, stories about stories. In Part 2, characters have read Part 1 and argue with Don Quixote about what really happened. Reality bends back on itself like a mirror reflecting a mirror. Comedy and tragedy no longer needed separate genres. Cervantes showed that the saddest moments could be the funniest, and the funniest could break your heart. Life was both at once. He created an unreliable narrator, claiming his story was translated from an Arab historian's manuscript, calling into question what was true even as he told it. Nothing could be trusted completely. The world learned new words from his creation. Quixotic entered every European language, meaning idealistic to the point of impracticality. Tilting at windmills became universal shorthand for fighting impossible battles. Translations spread the story everywhere within decades. By 1620, Don Quixote could be read in English, French, Italian, German, and Dutch. A Spanish novel became Europe's common property. Shakespeare may have known the story. A lost play called Cardenio existed, based on the episode in the Sierra Morena. 2 theatrical geniuses, perhaps sharing imagination across languages and seas. French comedy absorbed Cervantes completely. Molière's characters echo Don Quixote's delusions, his social criticism, his way of letting fools expose themselves through their own proud speeches. Russian writers worshipped him. Dostoevsky called Don Quixote the most beautiful book ever written. Turgenev saw in the knight a holy fool whose failure was more valuable than all worldly success. German romantics found in Cervantes their ideal. The tension between reality and dream, the beautiful soul crushed by a pragmatic world, the hero who refuses to accept things as they are. Across the Atlantic, Mark Twain declared Don Quixote one of the greatest books ever written. He saw in Cervantes a fellow satirist who loved what he mocked and mocked what he loved. Faulkner read Don Quixote every year, claiming it taught him how to write. The southern complexity, the failed ideals, the comedy hiding tragedy, all have roots in Cervantes' achievement. Borges wrote essays exploring Don Quixote's infinite depths, stories about men who rewrite Cervantes word for word and somehow create something entirely new. The book contains multitudes that expand with each reading. Kafka sensed a kinship. His bewildered protagonists facing incomprehensible systems resemble Don Quixote facing windmills he cannot understand are only windmills. Reality refuses to match expectation in both worlds. In 1965, Broadway transformed the story into Man of La Mancha, a musical that found hope in the darkest prison. Don Quixote became a symbol of resistance to despair. The impossible dream became an anthem for idealists everywhere. To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe. Cervantes' creation had become a song people sang at graduations and funerals. Orson Welles spent decades trying to film Don Quixote, shooting footage in multiple countries, never finishing before his death. The cursed project became legendary for its beautiful incompleteness. Terry Gilliam's multiple attempts to film the story collapsed spectacularly, documented in Lost in La Mancha. Floods, illness, and financial disasters stopped production. The windmills seemed to fight back. Picasso captured the pair in a simple sketch. Long thin knight, round short squire, bony horse, little donkey. Just a few lines, yet instantly recognizable. Visual shorthand for impossible friendship. Dalí's surrealist illustrations showed the book's dreamlike reality. Melting landscapes, distorted figures. The line between real and imagined dissolved completely in painted fever dreams of Spanish landscape. In Madrid's Plaza de España, bronze statues of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza sit before a monument to Cervantes. Tourists photograph them constantly. The imaginary knight has become more permanent than the author. UNESCO has tracked translations. Don Quixote is the second most translated book in history after the Bible. Every language, every culture has found something of themselves in the Spanish knight's impossible dreams. Scholars have written more about Don Quixote than almost any other novel. Libraries contain thousands of studies, interpretations, arguments about what Cervantes meant. The book generates meaning endlessly. The great question remains, was Don Quixote truly mad, or did he choose his madness as a deliberate escape from an unbearable world? Cervantes never answers, and every reader must decide. Some modern readings see him as revolutionary, refusing to accept the corrupt society around him, using imagination as resistance. His madness becomes sanity in a world that lost its reason first. His acts of madness are usually acts of kindness. He frees prisoners, defends women's choices, attacks those who abuse power. If this is madness, perhaps the world needs more of it. Sancho's transformation proves the book's depth. Beginning as simple comic relief, he grows into wisdom, challenges his master, nearly surpasses him. The squire becomes the knight's equal by the end. Dulcinea never speaks a word in the entire book. She exists only in Don Quixote's imagination and Sancho's lies. Yet she drives everything. Love for a fantasy can move the real world. The cruelest moment comes when sanity returns. On his deathbed, Alonso Quixano rejects everything Don Quixote believed. The cure is worse than the disease. He dies the moment he stops dreaming. Sancho begs him not to die, not to give up the dream. "Let us become shepherds as we planned," he cries. The squire has become the believer, and the knight has abandoned faith. The epitaph calls him Alonso Quixano the Good, not the wise or the great, but the good. Cervantes' final judgment was about character, not accomplishment. Goodness outlasts sanity. What does the book ask us? Perhaps this: what windmills do you tilt at? What impossible battles do you fight knowing you cannot win? What dreams refuse to let you go? In an age of constructed realities and virtual worlds, Don Quixote speaks more directly than ever. We all live in stories we didn't write, believing things that might not be true. The dignity of failure. That may be Cervantes' greatest gift. Don Quixote loses every battle, yet somehow wins something no victory could provide. Losing well may matter more than winning poorly. The friendship between master and squire remains one of literature's greatest portraits of unlikely love. Nobleman and peasant, dreamer and pragmatist. Becoming something neither could be alone. Against all cynicism, Don Quixote argues for believing in something, even something foolish, even something impossible. The alternative, believing in nothing, seems far worse than believing in too much. We laugh at Don Quixote, then realize we're laughing at ourselves. Our ambitions, our delusions, our stubborn refusal to accept limits. We are all, in some way, tilting at windmills. Cervantes wrote from prison, from poverty, from failure. He had every reason for bitterness, yet created something generous and wise. His wounds became our inheritance of laughter and tears. Spain found its soul in this book. A nation of conquerors learned to laugh at conquest. A culture of pride discovered the pride in admitting foolishness. Cervantes gave his country a mirror. Every culture has adopted them. Japanese manga, Bollywood films, African adaptations. The knight and squire cross every border because human dreams and human folly are universal languages. The power of stories to change reality. That is perhaps the book's deepest theme. Don Quixote read himself into being a knight. We read ourselves into being who we become. 400 years after his creation, Don Quixote still rides. Not toward any destination, but toward the horizon itself, where possibility never ends and giants might still be hiding in the mills. And somewhere always Sancho follows, grumbling about his stomach, worrying about his donkey, dreaming of islands, but never letting his strange master ride alone into whatever madness waits ahead. Cervantes' gift was giving us permission to fail beautifully. Don Quixote shows that sincerity matters more than success, that trying matters more than winning, that love matters more than object. When the world feels too real, too heavy, too resistant to dreams, remember the old man in rusty armor who refused to believe windmills were only windmills. Sometimes refusal is its own victory. The one-handed soldier who wrote these pages knew about pain, about captivity, about dreams deferred until they nearly died. He wrote through all of it and gave the world something immortal. Now his bones rest in Madrid, and his book rests on shelves in every country. The soldier found more lasting glory through stories than through any battlefield victory he ever dreamed. Don Quixote was the first fictional celebrity. Characters in Part 2 had read Part 1 and recognized him on the road. Fiction had never done that before. Story became self-aware. Author and character mirror each other. Both were soldiers who became dreamers. Both were wounded men who kept fighting. Both refused to accept that reality was fixed and final. Both grew old poor. Both faced mockery and failure. Both chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier. In the end, we cannot tell where Cervantes ends and Don Quixote begins. Perhaps the wound that maimed his hand healed into literature. Perhaps captivity in Algiers became the cave of Montesinos. Suffering transforms when passed through imagination into something the world can share. The story has no end. As long as someone reads it, Don Quixote rides. As long as someone dreams impossible dreams, the knight-errant tilts at whatever giants need tilting at today. Every generation finds them fresh. Every reader discovers something previous readers missed. The book grows rather than ages, becoming more itself with every century that passes over its pages. Out there somewhere on the plains of La Mancha, if you look at the right moment and believe in the right way, you might still see two figures on the dusty road, one tall and thin on a bony horse, one short and round on a patient donkey, still riding, still dreaming, still believing in something, and that, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all. Let's return now to that quiet bedroom where we left Don Quixote sleeping. The fever has finally broken, and something is stirring in the old man beneath the white sheets. His eyes open differently than before. There is no distant look, no searching for dragons in the ceiling beams. He sees the room exactly as it is, familiar, ordinary, his home. He asks for his family, and when they gather, niece, housekeeper, priest, barber, faithful Sancho, he tells them something that stops their hearts. I am not Don Quixote anymore. I am Alonso Quixote. They had prayed for this moment. Sanity restored, the madness cured. But now that it has arrived, they find themselves mourning. They loved the mad knight more than they knew. He calls for a priest to hear his confession. Whatever sins Don Quixote committed in his madness, Alonso Quixote will account for them with clear mind and open heart before God. He denounces the books of chivalry that drove him mad. They were lies, he says now, beautiful lies, but lies that made him ridiculous and caused pain to those who loved him. Sancho falls to his knees beside the bed, tears making rivers down his round cheeks. Don't die, master, he begs. We can still become shepherds. We can still tend flocks together. Alonso makes his will with careful attention. His small estate divided fairly. Niece to inherit the house. Housekeeper remembered for years of service. And Sancho, dear Sancho, forgiven any debts between them. To Sancho he gives more than money could buy, gratitude for loyalty, apology for hardships endured, and recognition that the peasant squire had been the truest friend a man could ask for. For 3 days he lingers, sometimes sleeping, sometimes speaking quietly with those who loved him, The house fills with neighbors coming to say goodbye to the strange, gentle man they had known. On the third evening, with sunset painting the walls orange and gold, Alonso Quixano the Good closes his eyes for the last time. The breath leaves him gently, like a whisper of wind. They bury him simply, as he wished. The epitaph names him only Alonso Quixano the Good. Not knight, not madman, not dreamer, just good. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it is everything. Sancho will return home to Teresa and tell these stories until his own death. The island never came. But something better did. A friendship that made a peasant into a philosopher. La Mancha settles back into its ancient silence. The dusty roads know no knight-errant now. Only farmers and merchants going about the ordinary business of ordinary lives. But something lingers. Perhaps in the quality of starlight on certain evenings, or in the way the wind moves through wheat fields. A memory of hoofbeats that will never quite fade completely. Picture those plains now as you drift towards sleep. Endless golden wheat stretching to every horizon. Moving in slow waves like a sea made of earth and sunlight and time. Somewhere in a quiet pasture old Rocinante grazes peacefully. No more charges. No more battles. Just grass and rest and the simple pleasure of a horse, finally allowed to be only a horse. Dapple stands nearby as always, loyal even in retirement. The donkey and the horse became friends through miles of shared road. And that friendship needs no adventures to sustain it. Evening falls softly over the Spanish countryside. Purple shadows lengthen across the land. And the first stars appear like promises kept by someone who never forgot. These are the same stars Don Quixote called upon to witness his vows. The same stars that watched him charge and fall, love and lose, dream and wake. They remember even if we forget. The windmills stand motionless now, their great sails still against the darkening sky. Whatever giants they contained have long since departed, leaving only honest machinery that grinds grain for bread. In some roadside inn, travelers gather by firelight, sharing wine and stories. Perhaps someone mentions the old madman who once passed through, and they smile at the memory without mockery. Somewhere in a quiet room, by candlelight, someone opens a book and begins to read. Once upon a time in a village of La Mancha. The story starts again, as it always does. And as the reader's eyes move across the words, something stirs. Imagination awakens. The sleeping knight rises from the page and rides again, through someone else's dreaming mind tonight. That's the secret of stories. They never really end. Every reader becomes a little bit Don Quixote, carrying forward the dream of something better, something nobler than what ordinary life allows. What windmills do you see on your horizon? What impossible battles call to you, even though winning seems beyond reach? Don Quixote asks us all these questions and never demands answers. What Dulcinea lives in your imagination? What perfect vision gives your efforts meaning? She need not be real. Don Quixote proved that imagined love can move the actual world. And who rides beside you, grumbling perhaps but loyal always? We all need our Sancho. Someone who sees our madness clearly but loves us through it, steadying the horse when we would charge recklessly. These questions don't need answers tonight. Let them rest in the quiet part of your mind where dreams are stored, waiting for mornings when you might want to think about them. For now, let La Mancha's warm wind carry you toward whatever dreams await. The Spanish plains stretch endlessly beneath the stars, and somewhere on them, peace is always possible. Thank you for journeying with me tonight through 4 centuries and across an ocean of pages. Cervantes would be pleased, I think, that his story still finds listeners in the dark. Whether you heard every word or drifted somewhere in the middle, whether you're still here or already sleeping, the story found you. That's what matters. Stories find who they need to find. The night rests now. No more battles to fight, no more giants to challenge. Just quiet and darkness, and the long sleep that even the most restless dreamers eventually accept. You can rest too. Let the armor of your day fall away. Let the lance of your worries lean against some distant wall. Tomorrow's battles belong to tomorrow. There will be windmills to face when morning comes. There always are. But morning is far away now, and the space between now and then belongs only to peace and dreaming. Tonight is for stillness. Tonight is for the gentle dark that asks nothing of you except surrender to rest. Tonight, no quests, no missions. Just breathing, just being just now. Somewhere Sancho Panza sleeps contentedly tonight, dreaming perhaps of islands, perhaps of good cheese, perhaps of nothing at all. His snoring would make you smile if you could hear it. One last image before I leave you. Picture an empty plain under endless stars, silence complete. No movement anywhere, just the vast and patient earth resting beneath the sky. Good night from the land of La Mancha to wherever you rest tonight. May your dreams be as vivid as Don Quixote's, and your waking as gentle as the Spanish sunrise. Sleep well. And if you dream of giants tonight, remember, they might be windmills, or they might be giants after all. Only you can decide which truth serves your heart better. Good night.